I'm not crazy, but I talk to dogs more than people now. And you know what? They're better listeners. Those were the first words Joe muttered as he crouched near the rusted fence behind the old diner on Maple Street. His beard was thick and weathered, his coat stitched in places with dental floss and safety pins, and his eyes held the kind of quiet sorrow you only see in people who've lived too long without a bed. But even in the drifting fog of early morning and the stale stench of spilled grease behind the kitchen, Joe's full attention was on the scruffy tan dog lying beneath a tipped-over crate. The dog hadn't moved in 2 days. Locals whispered about him. Some said he used to belong to a trucker who never came back. Others thought he'd been dumped by someone who couldn't afford to feed him anymore. But no one really knew, and fewer still had tried to get close. Every time someone approached, the dog either growled or shivered and turned away. He hadn't eaten since the diner owner tossed a slice of bacon his way almost 3 days ago. But that didn't stop Joe. He wasn't afraid of growls. He knew what hunger looked like, not just the kind in your stomach, but the kind that pressed against your ribs when loneliness curled up inside you. "Hey there, buddy," Joe said again, slowly sitting down cross-legged in the dirty alley. He pulled a crumpled brown paper bag from his coat. "I saved you half a sandwich. Roast beef. No onions. I know you guys hate onions." The dog didn't lift his head. He lay there like a pile of rags, his shaggy fur matted with rain and soot, ribs poking out like bent wire under his skin. Joe didn't move. He placed the sandwich gently on the pavement and backed up, sitting a few feet away. He didn't watch the dog. He looked up at the gray sky, then down at his palms, his thumbs tracing invisible scars. "Used to have a beagle, you know," he said, more to the sky than the dog. "Her name was Penny. She snored louder than my ex-wife." The dog blinked slowly. No other reaction. Joe sat there for hours. By noon, the diner's lunch rush came and went. The cook gave Joe a dirty look out the back window, but didn't say anything. Everyone had seen Joe before, just another drifter. He never begged, never caused trouble. He'd trade odd jobs for scraps and vanish before sunset. At dusk, the dog finally moved. Not much. Just a slow twitch of the nose, drawn by the faint scent of roast beef. Joe didn't flinch. He kept his eyes down. When night fell, the sandwich was gone. Not eaten clean, just nibbled. But Joe saw the crumbs and the small indent where the bread had been dragged. He smiled. "You're smarter than most," he said softly. "Don't trust just anyone? That's good." He left a can of tuna the next day, and the next, a handful of scrambled eggs from the diner's trash. Always sitting, always silent, never reaching. By the end of the week, the dog sat up when Joe arrived. The transformation was slow, a kind of quiet thawing. A tail wag, just once. A look that lasted longer than a second. Joe never pushed it. He knew too well what happened when you pushed broken things too hard. The locals began to notice. Kids called the dog Crate, and old Mrs. Goodwin from the dry cleaners left out water. But the dog only responded to Joe. On the 10th day, Joe brought a blanket. "Cold's coming," he said, carefully spreading it near the crate. "Not asking you to come home with me. I don't got one. Just maybe this helps." The dog didn't move, but by midnight, he was sleeping on it. Joe never stayed in one spot for long. He had a rhythm, a route. Bus station on Tuesdays, church basement on Thursdays for hot meals, library on rainy days to read magazines and warm his feet. But he kept coming back for Crate. And Crate waited. Winter hit hard that year. Ice sealed the sidewalks, and frost painted windshields with white lace. Joe's joints ached more than usual. His cough got rougher. One night, he didn't show. Crate waited. 2 nights passed. Then 3. The blanket stayed untouched. On the 4th night, a boy named Eric, who delivered groceries, saw Crate whimpering. The boy had a heart too big for his age. He followed the back alley all the way to the corner bus stop. There was Joe, curled on the bench, shivering under 3 coats, face pale. "Hey, mister," Eric said, shaking him. "You okay?" Joe blinked, eyes unfocused. "Dog, did he eat?" Eric called an ambulance. At the hospital, Joe kept asking about Crate. The nurses didn't understand. But one janitor, a kind man named Tim, had seen the dog once. "I'll check," Tim said. He went back to the alley that night. Crate was still there, watching the bench. Tim knelt and reached out. "Joe sent me," he said gently. For the first time, Crate approached a stranger. The hospital stay was long. Pneumonia, they said. Joe wasn't young, and life on the street made healing slow. But every few days, Tim brought updates. Pictures of Crate sleeping, eating, even chasing a pigeon once. The dog still refused to leave the alley, but he was healthier now. Stronger. Joe smiled through cracked lips. "Tell him I'll be back." He knows what that means. 2 weeks later, Joe left the hospital. He was thinner, a little bent over, but standing. He walked all the way back to the diner. Crate was waiting. This time, when Joe sat down, the dog walked right up and placed his head on the man's lap. And just like that, they were no longer 2 shadows drifting alone. They became something more, not just man and dog, but survivors who found each other when the world stopped looking. From then on, wherever Joe went, Crate followed. At the shelter, they shared a cot. At the food truck downtown, the owner gave Crate his own plate. At the park, Joe would talk to him for hours. And Crate, the dog who once refused to eat or move, now ran, barked, and even played fetch with a soda bottle someone tossed. They weren't fancy. They didn't have a house. But every morning, when the sun broke through the skyline and lit the old diner sign, they were there together. And for both of them, that was enough. For now. Joe never told anyone where he went during the day, not even Crate. But the dog followed him just the same. Up cracked sidewalks, past chain-link fences with plastic bags fluttering like flags, through alleys that smelled like stale fries and wet cardboard. Joe didn't speak much during their walks, but Crate didn't seem to mind. He walked a half-step behind, ears perked, shaggy tail swishing like a metronome to Joe's slow rhythm. Their mornings began the same. Joe would rise before the light fully stretched across the city, pat Crate's head, and say, "Come on, breakfast is waiting." Breakfast was rarely glamorous. Half a muffin from the bakery dumpster, an apple left on a library bench, once a slice of quiche someone tossed for being too cold. Crate always waited for Joe to take the first bite before eating his share. It became their ritual. That winter, a woman named Laura opened a second-hand bookstore on 5th and Ivy. She had red reading glasses, an oversized sweater, and a policy of not turning away people who needed to warm up. Joe discovered it by accident, slipping in one icy morning to browse a bin labeled "Free, Take One." Crate waited outside, curled at the door. Laura noticed. He yours? She asked, holding a mug of something steaming. Not really, Joe said, flipping through a book about mountain trails. We just sort of chose each other. She watched Crate through the glass. Looks like he's not going anywhere without you. Joe didn't respond, but before he left, she handed him the mug. You can bring him in next time. I keep towels near the heater. Joe nodded. The next morning they returned. The towels smelled like lavender. Crate sneezed twice, then laid down beside the radiator with a grunt. Joe sat on the floor nearby, reading an old collection of short stories and sipping something Laura called poor man's cocoa. Warm milk, cinnamon, and a dash of coffee. He said it tasted like childhood. Crate snored quietly. Laura didn't ask questions. She let them sit as long as they wanted. One afternoon, she slid a manila envelope across the table. Ever think about writing? Joe raised an eyebrow. About what? She shrugged. Anything. Some people write better than they talk. He didn't answer, but the next day he brought the envelope back, filled with neat, narrow handwriting. Stories about Penny the Beagle, about growing up in Missouri, about the way the city sounded different at night. Laura read each page with the reverence of a priest. You've got a voice, she said quietly. Joe chuckled. Never had much luck with voices. They usually get ignored. She made copies, left one by the register. Customers started asking. Joe's writing became a quiet feature of the shop, tucked between dog-eared paperbacks and jigsaw puzzles missing one piece. Crate became the unofficial greeter. Kids petted his ears. Retirees brought liver treats. He stopped flinching at loud noises, stopped trembling when someone reached too fast. He sat proudly beside the heater, like he owned the place. Joe and Crate never stayed overnight. Joe had rules. Keep moving, don't depend, don't ask. But by early March, Laura offered them the back storeroom for rainy nights. Just until spring, she said, like they were only renting the weather. The storeroom smelled like dust and ink and forgotten pages. Joe set up a small cot. Crate had a pillow under the window. At night, they listened to the rain tap against the glass. Joe told stories in the dark. Crate listened. One evening, while organizing donations, Laura found an old photo album labeled The Hendersons, 1978 to 1985. She handed it to Joe without a word. He flipped through slowly. Kids with freckles. A dog with one ear flopped forward. A man who looked like him, only younger, standing beside a woman at a picnic. He didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he closed the album. I used to be somebody, then life happened. Crate rested his head on Joe's knee. Joe ran a hand through the dog's fur. I don't need to be somebody anymore. This is enough. But life, as it often does, had other plans. One warm afternoon, a reporter came by the bookstore. A small paper, local circulation, but curious about the stories taped by the register. Mind if I do a little piece on you? She asked Joe. You've got a way with words. He hesitated. Crate nudged his arm. Joe looked at Laura. It's your story, she said. He agreed. The article ran the next Sunday. Just 2 columns, a black and white photo of Joe sitting on the sidewalk with Crate. The title read, The Man Who Writes the Streets. By Monday, people started dropping by. A few brought books for Joe. Others left bones for Crate. One man in a wool vest said, You made me cry, man. Haven't done that in 20 years. Joe smiled politely. He didn't like being watched, but he understood what it meant. His words reached people. That meant something. By April, The bookstore had a small corner named Crate's Corner, 3-floor pillows, a basket of dog toys, and a corkboard filled with notes from visitors. Some thanked Joe, others wrote stories of their own. A child left a drawing of Crate wearing sunglasses. Joe read every one. Sometimes he added his own reply. Things seemed steady for the first time in a long while. Joe had a rhythm again. Mornings spent writing, afternoons walking, evenings with Crate under the glow of bookstore lights. But stability doesn't always sit easy. One Friday, Joe went out to buy bread with change collected in a glass jar. He told Crate to stay. He didn't come back. Crate waited at the door until midnight. The next morning, Laura found him curled beside Joe's cot. The jar was still on the table, untouched. She called hospitals. No sign. Police had no records. It was like he vanished. 3 days passed. On the 4th, Crate broke the rule and left the store. He wandered the streets, nose low, tracing every step they used to take. He sat by the bench near the bus stop, sniffed around the bakery, circled the library steps. Laura watched from her car. Crate wasn't lost. He was looking. By evening, she followed him to the underpass near 8th. He barked once. A weak cough answered. Joe was there, slumped behind a pillar, hands shaking. "Didn't want anyone to see me like this," he muttered, as Laura helped him up. "You don't have to disappear to protect us," she said. "We're not scared." Crate licked Joe's hand. They walked home slowly. After that, Joe didn't hide anymore. He let people help a little. A coat from a stranger. A dentist appointment, finally. Even a haircut, though he grumbled the whole time. Crate kept watch through it all. Late spring brought change again. Laura was offered a grant to expand the store. She needed help. She asked Joe to manage the new donation section. "You know stories better than anyone." He said yes. Quietly. But he said it. He brought Crate with him every morning, now wearing a red bandana someone sent in the mail. Joe kept writing. More people came. And somewhere between all the pages and pause, they found what they didn't know they were missing. A place. Not flashy. Not famous. But enough. For now. And that, Joe often thought as he watched Crate chase butterflies near the book bins, was the best kind of happy there was. Crate's bandana was a hit with the neighborhood kids. Every morning, as Joe unlocked the back door of the bookstore, a few early risers would wave from across the street, or run over just to pat Crate's head and tell him he looked cool. The red fabric was frayed at the edges now, faded from the sun, but Crate wore it with pride. He had gone from a trembling stray to the unofficial mascot of a quiet block that had, over time, softened around him. Joe didn't say much about it, but he noticed the change. The way people nodded when he passed. The way they looked at Crate like he belonged, like he had roots here. He never said it aloud. But something in his chest loosened a little more each week. Laura's store, now repainted with a fresh sign and a mural of stacked books and paw prints, buzzed more than ever. Joe still handled the donation corner. He had a knack for knowing where things belonged. First editions, cookbooks, those thick spy novels that retirees loved to swap and debate. Crate had his spot, too. A custom-built bench under the window where sun pooled in long, golden streaks. Laura sewed a cushion with tiny bones stitched into the pattern. Crate spent his afternoons watching cars roll by, nose twitching at the smell of pretzels from the vendor down the block. One afternoon, a man named Gary wandered in. He was older, maybe mid-60s, clean-shaven but with wild white eyebrows. He had the slow, cautious gait of someone who'd spent too many years looking over his shoulder. "You Joe?" he asked, voice like some gravel scraped across wood. Joe nodded from behind a crate of discounted biographies. Gary pointed to a stapled pamphlet on the bulletin board, one of Joe's early stories Laura had copied and pinned. "I read this at the vet clinic. Thought you sounded familiar." Joe squinted, stepping closer. "Do I know you?" Gary chuckled. "You knew me as Red. Fort Leonard Wood, 83. You used to beat me at poker with that crooked smile of yours." Joe blinked. It took a second. Then he laughed, a low, honest sound that caught Laura's attention from the register. "Red," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't heard that name in 40 years. You still got that awful tattoo?" Gary grinned and rolled up his sleeve. There it was, an eagle with wings too short and a wonky banner across its belly. Joe slapped his knee. They sat on the floor, leaning against crates, talking for hours. Crate laid beside them, head on Joe's boot, ears flicking now and then. "He yours?" Gary asked, tossing Crate a biscuit Laura kept behind the counter. Joe shook his head. "We just found each other." Gary nodded like he understood. "That's how the best ones start." Over the next few weeks, Gary became a regular. He brought old records for the store and peanut butter biscuits for Crate. He and Joe started playing chess near the window. They rarely spoke while they played, just grunted and smirked and occasionally muttered insults about each other's strategy. One Thursday, Gary didn't show. Joe waited until the store closed, pretending not to worry. But the next morning, he went looking. He checked the vet clinic, the food pantry, the bench outside the DMV. Nothing. He found him 2 days later, sitting behind the laundromat with a wrapped knee and a sour expression. "Slipped on a step," Gary muttered. "Doc says I gotta keep off it. Feels like someone nailed my leg to a frozen plank." Joe helped him up. Crate leaned in, steadying Gary's wobble. They brought him to the bookstore. Laura cleared space in the back. "Guess we're starting a retirement wing," she joked. Gary stayed for a week. He read mystery novels and napped beside Crate. When his knee healed, he still came by, but more slowly now, with a cane and a sigh. The days rolled on. Summer came fast. The block turned bright with hanging flower baskets and kids selling lemonade in plastic cups. Joe hated the heat, but Crate loved it. He'd stretch out on the sidewalk, belly up, tongue lolling, while passers-by stopped to snap photos. One day, a man in a suit approached. He didn't look like a local. Too pressed, too polished. He watched Joe for a while, then stepped forward. "Excuse me, are you the one who wrote How the Sidewalk Listened?" Joe raised a brow. "That was just a journal entry. Laura thought it was worth posting." The man smiled. "It's more than that. I run a small publishing house out in Portland. We feature underrepresented voices. Yours stuck with me. Would you consider compiling more of your pieces? We'd like to publish them." Joe stared. "It won't be a big print run," the man added quickly. "Just a few thousand copies. We'd handle everything. You'd get a small advance and royalties." Joe didn't answer right away. Crate looked up at him. "Let me think on it," he finally said. That night, he sat under the bookstore awning, watching the sky flicker between gold and lavender. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Crate. "You think people want to read what a tired old man scribbled down in between coffee breaks and dog walks?" Crate didn't answer, just nudged his head into Joe's palm. Laura said yes, obviously. Gary said it was about time someone noticed. A few of the kids made drawings for the book cover, one with Crate wearing glasses, one with Joe holding a typewriter under his arm like a guitar. Joe said yes. The publishing process took months. Joe sent over what he had. The editors worked gently, trimming and tightening, but never changing the soul of his stories. He didn't care much about the money. What he did care about was the title. He called it Crate and the Corner. When the first box of books arrived, Laura made a sign and set them by the register. The first customer to buy one asked for Joe's autograph. He froze for a second, then laughed and signed it, for anyone who's ever listened when no one else did. Crate got his paw print stamped inside the front cover. More orders came, then a request from a local school, then a radio show. Joe did an interview, his voice low and steady. He talked about the years no one saw him, and the dog that changed that. One morning, he received a letter. Thick paper, blue envelope, no return address. Inside was a check, $500, and a note. I read your book. My brother lived like you once. I didn't understand him until now. Thank you. Joe showed the letter to Crate. We did something good, huh? Crate licked his chin. Despite the buzz, Joe didn't change. He still walked the same path, still drank cheap coffee, still listened more than he spoke. But he wrote more now, filled more notebooks, left more pages for Laura to read and pin. Crate stayed the same too. Loyal, patient, a silent anchor. One day, Joe caught him staring at a little terrier across the street. She was white and curly, wearing a purple bow. She yipped twice. Crate tilted his head. Oh no, Joe said, chuckling. Don't you start falling in love. I'm not ready to be a dog grandpa. But that weekend, he bought a second bowl. Crate never used it. Not yet. But Joe kept it clean, just in case. The city moved around them. Shops opened and closed. People came and went. But Crate's corner stayed. So did the stories. And Joe, for the first time in a long while, stopped worrying about the day after tomorrow. The 4th of July hit the neighborhood like a firecracker tucked in a paper bag. Loud, sudden, and a little messy. The streets buzzed with folding chairs, tangled extension cords, children with sticky faces, and dogs in bandanas. Crate wore a new one, blue with tiny stars, courtesy of the boy who sold lemonade outside the bike shop. Joe didn't much care for holidays, but Crate did. Fireworks scared him, sure. He'd flatten himself under the donation counter the minute the first pop cracked the air. But everything before that? He loved it. The dropped hot dog buns, the scritches from strangers, the scent of charcoal and excitement. Joe grumbled about the noise, but he smiled more than usual that week. Laura's store held a sidewalk sale. Everything on the table outside was pay what you feel, and most people left more than they took. Joe sat in a folding chair. Crate sprawled at his feet. Gary leaned beside them with a foam cup of iced tea, fanning himself with a magazine. Someone asked if I was your manager, Gary muttered. Joe didn't look up from his notebook. What did you say? That I charged $20 for a photo with the dog, and $25 for a signed copy. Joe chuckled. Crate let out a soft huff. A woman in her 30s crouched beside Crate, her sunglasses sliding down her nose. Is it true he used to live behind a diner? Joe nodded. He didn't just live there, he ruled it, kept the alley in line. Very prestigious. She giggled. I read about you too. I bought your book for my dad. He cried, then made me cry. Thanks for that. Joe tipped an imaginary hat. The crowd thinned as the sun dipped behind the buildings. People packed up tables, folded flags, and herded kids sticky with popsicle juice toward home. The fireworks were set to start over the river at 9. Joe didn't plan to go. He never did. But that evening, as he closed the store gate, Crate tugged his leash toward the sidewalk. Joe frowned. "Fireworks, remember? You hate those." Crate tugged again. Joe sighed. "Fine, but we're standing far back. And if you dive under someone's picnic table, I'm not pulling you out." They reached the edge of the park just as the first explosion lit the sky. Crate flinched, but didn't bolt. Joe kept a firm hand on his collar, crouching beside him. The bursts of color painted the night like spilled candy. Kids shrieked, couples hugged. Music drifted from battery-powered radios. Joe watched, silent. Crate leaned into his leg. Beside them, a teenage boy stood holding a small sign that read, "Free Hugs." He looked awkward and sincere. A young girl walked up and hugged him. Then another. Then a man in a wheelchair. Joe watched, bemused. "What a world," he muttered. Crate let out a low bark. Back at the store, Joe wrote that night. He titled the entry, "Fireworks for the Broken." July faded into August like a slow blink. The heat settled thick on the streets, heavy enough to slow conversation. Laura put out fans. Joe kept to iced tea and cold sandwiches. Crate sprawled in front of the box fan like a hairy rug. One particularly hot Thursday, a woman arrived holding a clipboard and a camera. Her name was Beth. She was making a short documentary on small towns and unlikely heroes. Someone told her about Joe and Crate. "Do you mind if I film a few minutes?" she asked. "Just your day-to-day. I won't ask anything personal." Joe hesitated. Crate stood and sniffed her shoes. "I don't know about hero," he said. "That's okay," she replied. "Most of the good ones don't." She spent the day filming them shelving books, writing postcards, handing out water bottles to the homeless man who stopped by every few days. Crate licked someone's toddler. Beth laughed. That night, she asked, "What's kept you going all these years?" Joe thought a long time before answering. Habit, and then hope. She nodded, and that was that. The short film went online 2 weeks later. Laura set up a laptop by the register. People stood in line to watch. It was gentle, quiet, full of slow shots of Crate yawning and Joe thumbing through books. The title? The Listener and His Dog. Comments poured in. Joe didn't have a computer, but Laura read him some. This gave me peace. My dad lived on the streets. I wish someone like Joe had been there for him. I hope Crate gets unlimited treats forever. One said simply, "I see you." Joe didn't say much about it, but he kept the printout of that comment in his coat pocket. Summer slipped away. School supplies filled store shelves. The heat dulled to a bearable warmth. Crate's fur got a trim, which he hated, but Laura insisted. "You look like a walking mop," she told him. Crate pouted for 2 days. In September, an old friend of Gary's showed up. His name was Russell. He used a walker and smelled like peppermint gum and chewing tobacco. He and Gary had served together. They brought out stories Joe had never heard. About bar fights in Europe. A goat stolen from a colonel. A bet involving a pair of flaming boots. Joe laughed so hard his ribs ached. Russell started hanging around. He read mysteries to Crate in the afternoons. Crate listened, head on his paws, eyes half-lidded. One Thursday, Laura came into the back with a look Joe recognized. Something was off. "City inspector came by," she said. "There's a zoning issue. They're trying to say we're not up to code." Joe straightened. "What kind of issue?" She handed him a paper. It was full of legalese and warnings. Apparently, the new mural on the outside wall extended over a property line by a foot. A complaint had been filed. By who? Doesn't say. But if we can't resolve it, we might get fined or shut down. Joe stared at the paper. Crate sat beside him, quiet. He stood, brushed off his knees. "Let's fix it." Over the next week, they repainted the mural, moved it back by a foot. Volunteers helped. Kids held paintbrushes. Gary brought lemonade. Laura paid for pizza. Crate stepped in green paint and left 2 perfect paw prints on the sidewalk. They left them there. The inspector returned, took a look, nodded. No fines, no shutdown. Laura sighed. Joe went back to sorting cookbooks. Later that night, Laura said, "You could have walked away. Why help fix something that isn't technically yours?" Joe shrugged. "Feels like mine. That's enough." October came with cooler winds and crunchy leaves. Crate wore a little sweater now, despite his protests. Joe carved pumpkins with the kids from the corner school. His said, "Hope," in clumsy block letters. Crate's had a bone etched in with a spoon. On Halloween, they set out a bowl labeled "Take One," or "Be Haunted by Crate." Most kids took 2. Crate didn't mind. The neighborhood grew around them, like ivy, like family. And still, every morning, Joe unlocked the back door, and Crate padded in beside him, ready to listen, ready to begin again. Joe didn't notice the first cold wind until Crate gave him that look, the one that said, "You forgot your gloves again, old man." It was late November, the air sharp enough to sting, the kind of cold that makes your thoughts brittle if you don't move fast enough. Leaves clung stubbornly to the trees, browned and curled, not yet ready to fall. The bookstore was warm, though. Laura had finally installed a second space heater, and Crate made a game of racing it to his favorite spot by the window each morning. Joe let him win every time. Business slowed as it always did around this time. People saved their dollars for holiday gifts and thick coats. The store still had regulars, though. Gary, Russell, the girl who only read westerns, the college kid who left sticky notes inside philosophy books. And, of course, the families who came just to say hi to Crate. Joe started writing more in the evenings, when the sky darkened too fast and the world outside went quiet. His stories shifted, still full of small joys and odd memories, but more reflective now. He wrote about Thanksgiving dinners he used to attend, about burning his hand on a pie tin, about a silent walk through the woods after a funeral he never spoke of aloud. One piece he left untitled. Laura read it and cried. She didn't say why. Crate stayed close on those nights. He seemed to sense when Joe's thoughts got too loud. He would curl up with his chin on Joe's foot or press his nose into the crook of Joe's elbow until the man looked up and smiled. The week before Thanksgiving, a new man came to the store, tall, lean, with a face like he'd just run out of second chances. His name was Paul. He carried a duffel bag that sagged from the weight of his life. He didn't say much that first day, just browsed the shelves, bought a battered copy of The Old Man and the Sea, and nodded when Joe thanked him. But he returned the next day, and the next. On the third day, he lingered near the donation table where Joe was sorting a box of hand-me-downs. "You're the guy who writes, right?" Joe looked up, nodding. "I read something of yours once, about a sock with a hole in it and a train ride to nowhere." Joe chuckled. "Didn't think anyone read that one." Paul shifted his weight. "I did. Twice." Crate padded over, sniffed Paul's bag, then sat beside him like they'd known each other for years. "Friendly dog," Paul murmured. Joe smiled. "He chooses who he wants." Paul gave a half shrug. "Guess I got lucky." They didn't talk much more that day, but when Paul left, he patted Crate's head and said, "Thanks." The next time he came in, he stayed longer, helped Gary move a box of encyclopedias, fixed the hinge on the bathroom door. Laura offered him a cup of coffee and pointed to a chair by the back wall. "This place," he said quietly, "feels like something I lost a long time ago." Joe didn't ask what. Instead, he offered him a seat at the little table by the heater. Crate plopped down beside them. They sipped coffee in silence. That night, Joe wrote about second arrivals, how some people don't knock when they come back into the world. They just slide in like they never left. By Thanksgiving week, Paul was part of the furniture. He still hadn't said where he was staying, but Laura didn't pry. She just handed him a broom or a box or a bowl of soup when it looked like he needed one. Gary and Russell invited him to their usual Thursday card game. Paul said yes, lost $5, and laughed harder than anyone. Joe watched him sometimes, carefully. There was something in Paul's eyes. A storm calmed, but not gone. Joe didn't push. He knew better than anyone how some stories had to be told sideways, in gestures and pauses. The night before Thanksgiving, Laura stayed late. She brought in a folding table and covered it with a faded tablecloth printed with turkeys and pumpkins. "We'll open early tomorrow," she said. "Not for business, for breakfast." Joe looked at her. "You sure?" She nodded. "Not everyone has somewhere to go. Might as well be here." They all pitched in. Gary made eggs. Russell brought a tray of muffins. Paul peeled potatoes like a man on a mission. Joe brewed coffee. Crate supervised. Thanksgiving morning, the store glowed. People drifted in slowly, some carrying plates, some with hands in their pockets, some with nothing but an appetite and a quiet thanks. They shared stories and jokes and lumpy mashed potatoes. Crate got 3 helpings of turkey and a kiss on the nose from a toddler. Joe sat at the end of the table, watching it all, his plate mostly untouched. "Something wrong?" Paul asked. Joe shook his head. "No, just didn't think I'd ever be part of something like this again." Paul raised his cup. "Neither did I." They clinked cups like it mattered. In the days that followed, something shifted. The cold settled deeper. People bundled tighter. Crate's sweater got an extra layer. Then, one morning, Joe found Paul sitting on the back steps with his bag beside him. "You leaving?" Joe asked. Paul looked up, eyes red from the wind. Or maybe not the wind. "Wasn't planning to, but got a call. My sister's kid, he wants to meet me. They live in Ohio. She said it's time." Joe nodded slowly. "You gonna go?" "I think I have to." Joe sat beside him, their knees barely touching. "You think it'll be good?" Paul asked. Joe smiled faintly. "I think good's never guaranteed, but trying counts." Paul laughed, low and hoarse. "You always talk like that?" "Just when people are listening." Paul left the next day, not with a big speech or a dramatic goodbye, just a hug for Laura, a nod for Gary, and a final scratch behind Crate's ear. Joe walked him to the bus stop. Neither spoke much. As the bus pulled away, Paul pressed a hand to the window. Joe raised his fingers in return, then walked home. Crate was waiting on the bookstore steps, tail thumping softly. December arrived with frost and hush. The streets quieted, the store filled with the scent of cinnamon and the whisper of turning pages. One afternoon, a letter came. It was from Paul. Inside was a photo. Paul, standing awkwardly beside a boy with a gap-toothed grin. Behind them, a Christmas tree tilted slightly to the left. The note read, "You were right. Trying counts." Joe showed the photo to Crate. "Looks like he made it." Crate barked once, then fell asleep on Joe's boot. That night, Joe wrote the last page in his old notebook, then opened a new one. He wrote at the top, "Stories that found their way back." And below it, in small, steady letters, "Not finished. Just begun." Snow didn't come right away that winter. It waited, crouching behind clouds, letting the cold stretch its fingers across the city first. The wind howled through alleyways and made the bookstore's windows rattle just enough to remind you that something was coming. Joe had taken to wearing 2 scarves, one layered over the other like a makeshift armor. Crate didn't seem to mind the chill. He would still trot alongside Joe during their morning walks, leaving little wet paw prints on the frosted sidewalks. His winter coat had come in thick and full, and Laura joked that he looked like a furry loaf of bread with legs. The bookstore was quieter now, not just because of the season. The energy had shifted, settled into something softer. People came in to escape the cold more than anything else. They lingered over books, sipping tea, or just sitting near the heater with their coats still on. Joe didn't mind. He liked the quiet. He liked the way the heat creaked through the old vents, and the way Crate snored like an old man by the front door. A woman named Carol had started stopping by more regularly. She was in her late 60s, wore hand-knit sweaters and always brought something sweet, banana bread, ginger cookies, once even a pie. She never said much about her past, but she had a laugh that made people relax, and eyes that didn't miss much. One day she handed Joe a sealed envelope. "This was my husband's. He wrote poems. I thought you might like them." Joe opened it slowly, leafing through the pages. The handwriting was slanted and elegant. Words about trees and hands and silence. "He ever publish?" Joe asked. Carol shook her head. "Never got the nerve." Joe looked at the last page, then back at her. "Would you mind if I typed a few up? Maybe posted them in the front window?" She smiled. He would have liked that. Within a week, Carol's husband's poems sat beside the register in a little handmade booklet titled "Quiet Things That Matter." People started asking for copies. Joe printed more. The stack grew. A few people added their own poems. One teenage boy wrote about his sneakers. A teacher left a haiku about traffic lights. Someone else taped a folded napkin to the corkboard with a verse scrawled in Sharpie. Laura called it the poetry window. Joe just called it nice. Crate kept his usual duties. He patrolled the store, nudged kids who looked sad, warmed the feet of anyone who sat still long enough. He had a sixth sense for people who needed comfort. Joe swore he could have been a therapy dog if someone had given him a vest. Just before Christmas, a box arrived at the store with no return address. Inside were 2 wool blankets, a bag of dog biscuits shaped like candy canes, and a card that read, "For the 2 who remind us it's okay to be found." No signature. No hint. Joe folded the blankets neatly and put them in the back room. Crate devoured the biscuits with serious purpose. On Christmas Eve, Laura hosted a quiet gathering in the shop. Just a handful of folks. Gary, Russell, Carol, the kid with the sticky notes, a few others. They brought mismatched mugs of cocoa, a small fake tree decorated with paper stars, and a radio playing soft piano carols. Joe sat near the heater, Crate curled beside him, listening to the murmurs and laughter. Russell raised his mug. To the warmest cold place in the city. They all clinked whatever they had. That night, after the store was locked and the streets emptied of the last-minute shoppers and delivery vans, Joe took Crate on a slow walk through the neighborhood. Lights blinked in windows. Wreaths hung on doors. The quiet felt deeper, somehow more forgiving. Joe stopped by the bench near the bus stop, the one he hadn't sat on since Paul left. He sat. Crate jumped up beside him, which earned a small grunt of protest but no real pushback. Joe stared at the night sky. I used to hate this time of year. All the expectations, all the noise. Crate tilted his head. Now it just feels still. Crate pressed his shoulder into Joe's side. When they returned, Joe pulled one of the wool blankets from the back and laid it across the cot. He ran a hand over the fabric slowly, thinking about the hands that folded it, the decision to send it. Someone out there was listening. The new year came without fanfare. No fireworks, no countdown, no noisy celebration. Just a slow morning and a sky that looked like paper waiting for ink. Laura handed Joe a folder labeled Ideas. Inside were scribbled notes, workshop schedules, story prompts, a flyer template titled Write with Joe. He stared at it for a long time. I thought maybe once a week, Laura said gently. You've got a way of making people feel safe. I think folks would write more if you were there. Joe didn't answer right away. He turned the pages, saw his name typed next to words like facilitator and mentor. It felt strange, heavy, but not wrong. I'll give it a try, he said at last. The first session had 4 people. Carol, the sticky note kid, a college student who smelled like anxiety and peppermint, and a man named Vince who said nothing at all, just wrote with furious speed. Joe didn't lecture. He just offered a question. What did today teach you? They all wrote. Crate slept under the table, tail twitching in a dream. By the 3rd week, 8 people came, then 10. Joe started bringing in old typewriters, borrowed from the thrift shop. People loved the sound, said it felt more real. The group called themselves the Window Writers. Each week, someone's piece went up in the poetry window. Crate got treats every meeting. Joe kept a private journal just for quotes from the group. In early February, a letter arrived addressed to Crate. Inside was a certificate. Honorary member of the Downtown Therapy Circle. Below it, a note. We've never met, but your story helped me through a bad patch. Thank you for reminding me that healing doesn't bark. It sits beside you and waits. Joe taped it above Crate's sleeping pillow. You're official now, he told the dog. Crate wagged his tail and yawned. One morning, after a heavy snow, Joe walked past the old diner where it all started. The back alley looked smaller now. The Crate was gone. The fence, rustier, but the space held a silence Joe recognized. He stood there a while. A man came out the back door of the diner, apron dusted with flour. You need something? he asked, not unkind. Joe shook his head. Just remembering. The man looked him over. Hey, wait. Are you the guy with the dog? From the stories? Joe blinked. The man grinned. I remember that mutt. Wouldn't eat a bite. You're the one who got him to stay. That was you, right? Joe smiled. Yeah, that was me. The man nodded. Good dog. Weird eyes. Smart, though. You still got him? Joe gestured to the sidewalk. Crate sat there watching patiently. The man waved. Crate barked once. I'll be darned, the cook said. Well, tell him he's missed. Joe chuckled. I think he knows. He walked home slower that day. That night, he wrote another story. About patience. About waiting for someone to see you. About finding warmth in places no one expected. He titled it, The Sidewalk Still Remembers. Laura cried again. Crate slept on Joe's foot. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Quiet and sure, like a promise that hadn't yet been broken. Crate didn't care about birthdays, but Joe insisted they celebrate anyway. He didn't know the dog's exact age, just that it had been 3 years since Crate first crawled out from under the diner crate and accepted half a sandwich with more suspicion than trust. They'd picked the middle of February to mark the day. Cold, quiet, and perfectly forgettable, until Crate made it otherwise. Joe wrote Crate Day in block letters on a small whiteboard by the front door of the bookstore. Laura added a smiley face and a doodle of a bone. Russell brought bacon biscuits, Gary brought a harmonica, and the window writers wrote poems about friendship, fur, and forgiveness. A second grader from the nearby school made a birthday card shaped like a dog bowl. Crate sniffed it once, sneezed, and then carried it to his pillow like it was the most important thing he'd ever received. Joe sat in his usual corner, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching it all. He doesn't even know it's his birthday, Laura said, handing him a plate of lemon bars. Joe shrugged. Maybe not. But he knows he's loved. That's enough. By afternoon, the store was full. Not packed like a summer fair, but full of the kind of folks who made room for one another. People shared chairs, leaned on walls, balanced paper plates on their knees. Someone brought a tiny speaker and played folk music. Crate wandered through it all like a host making rounds. He stopped beside a man in a denim jacket who was quietly crying over a story Joe had taped to the front window. The man didn't say a word, just reached out and rested a hand gently on Crate's back. Crate stood still for a moment, then sat. The man didn't move his hand. Joe saw it all, didn't interrupt. He knew the power of silent company. That night, after the store had emptied and the last cookie crumb had been swept into the bin, Joe and Crate sat outside on the stoop. The wind was soft. The stars were out, flickering like the world's quiet heartbeat. Joe leaned back. You ever think about how far we've come? Crate blinked slowly. I used to talk to walls. Now I talk to you. Same difference, really, but you're less judgmental. Crate's tail thumped. Joe reached into his coat and pulled out a small, square tin. Inside were 4 pieces of dried jerky. He gave one to Crate and kept one for himself. To whatever this is, he said. They ate in sync. March rolled in with gray skies and long rains. The bookstore roof leaked near the back, so Joe and Laura set out pots during storms. Gary claimed he could fix it. Joe told him he didn't trust a man who once used duct tape to repair a toaster. Still, They climbed up there together one Saturday with a bundle of shingles, a hammer, and more enthusiasm than expertise. Crate supervised from the ground, ears twitching each time one of them cursed under their breath. By the end of the day, the leak was patched, the sky had cleared, and Joe had a new story called The Rooftop Fixers Club. It joined the growing stack of stories Laura was compiling for a second book. She'd been hinting at it for months. Joe kept dodging the subject. "I'm not sure anyone wants more," he said one afternoon. Laura didn't look up from the register. "You're wrong," Joe grunted. "Wouldn't be the first time." She slid a folder across the counter. "These are letters from readers, all asking for more." Joe opened it. Read one, then another. He didn't say anything, just folded the folder under his arm and walked to the back. The next day, he started writing again with purpose. Longer pieces, deeper ones. He wrote about the quiet guilt that comes with surviving, about the ache of remembering someone's laugh and forgetting their name. He wrote about Crate watching him like a lighthouse in reverse, guiding him home without moving an inch. One morning, he found Crate waiting at the door with a leash in his mouth. "You planning the route now?" Joe said. Crate wagged once. They walked farther that day, past the old post office, past the community garden where winter weeds pushed through forgotten soil. They stopped at a bench overlooking the river. Joe hadn't been there in years. They sat in silence. The river was half-iced, breaking apart like puzzle pieces in slow motion. Joe looked down at Crate. "I didn't know I needed you. Still don't fully understand why you stayed." Crate yawned. "Yeah, I guess some things don't need understanding." That night, Joe wrote another story, just 2 pages, titled The One Who Waited Anyway. April came. A little early, a little hopeful. Crocuses poked through patches of dirt near the bus stop. Someone left a chalk drawing of Crate on the sidewalk in front of the store, complete with his red bandana and sleepy eyes. Joe left it there until the rain washed it away. The window writers hosted their first reading event. Folding chairs, twinkle lights, a microphone that buzzed no matter what they did. People read poems and letters and stories. Some shook with nerves. Some grinned like they were finally being seen. Joe read last. A piece about the first winter he spent on the street. About how a pair of wool socks given to him by a woman who said nothing saved his feet. He ended the piece with the line, "Kindness doesn't always need a return address." The applause lasted longer than he expected. Crate barked once and wagged his tail so hard he knocked over a folding chair. May arrived with green trees and yellow sun, and something else. An energy that made the bookstore feel like the center of something bigger. People came from farther away. Some had read about the shop in articles. Some saw the film. Some just wandered in off the street and stayed because the air inside felt kinder. A woman named Trish came in one Tuesday. She wore a business coat, but looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She sat in the poetry corner for hours without touching a book. Joe eventually brought her tea, didn't ask questions. She came back the next day and the next. Finally, she said, "My dad used to bring me here when I was little, back when it was a toy store." Joe nodded. "Things change. Some stay the same." Trish looked at Crate. "I think I needed to remember something safe." Crate licked her hand. Trish started writing short poems, taped them to the wall herself. Laura printed a sign. Found. Words for the lost. In June, Someone donated a piano. Old, upright, 2 keys broken. They wedged it into the front corner of the shop, near Crate's bench. A teenager named Miles started playing it every Saturday. Blues, mostly, sometimes show tunes. Crate would fall asleep to the sound. Joe sat with him, scribbling lines in a battered notebook, humming along. The store felt alive in a new way. Less like a shelter, more like a heart. Pumping steady, quiet, certain. Joe didn't say it out loud, but he felt it. They were building something. Not a business, not a legacy. Just a place where people could show up and be, and not be asked why. And Crate? Crate was at the center of it all. He'd become more than a dog, more than a mascot. He was a story everyone wanted to believe in. Joe just kept walking beside him, step by step, into the days still waiting to be written. The first real heat of summer came in a wave that wrapped the city like wet cotton. The kind of sticky warmth that turned metal park benches into stovetops and melted chocolate before it made it home. Joe switched to linen shirts, the few he had, and Crate started spending more time sprawled belly up under the shop's front window, tongue lolling out in a dramatic sigh of canine suffering. Laura placed a fan beside him and froze a few water bottles to keep in his bowl. Gary joked about buying the dog a kiddie pool. Russell actually did it. Joe found it outside the back door one morning, a bright blue plastic circle with cartoon fish painted on the bottom. He shook his head, chuckling, and filled it with cold water from the hose behind the diner. Crate stared at it like it was an alien. Then he stepped in with exaggerated caution, one paw at a time, until he was sitting like a king in a bath. Word spread quickly. By noon, a small circle of neighborhood kids were gathered around, laughing as Crate splashed and pawed at the water. One of them, a boy named Evan, who rarely spoke, reached out and placed a toy boat in the pool beside Crate. Crate didn't move, just watched it float. Then, with a slow nose nudge, sent it gently back to the boy. Evan smiled. Joe noticed. He saw everything. Inside the store, the shelves were shifting. Laura had rearranged to make room for more poetry. Joe's second collection was nearly done, thanks to her constant nudging and the steady stream of voices contributing to the poetry window. They weren't all polished. Some were barely legible. But everyone mattered. Joe had taken to calling them street songs. On the 4th Saturday of the month, a new tradition took root. They called it Story Porch. Not really a porch, just a few lawn chairs set up under the awning out front. People read what they'd written, or shared memories, or simply talked while the city hummed around them. One night, Gary read a letter he'd never mailed to his brother. Another time, Carol sang a lullaby her mother used to hum while quilting. A college student named Brooke told a story about a bike ride, a thunderstorm, and the boy she never saw again. Joe didn't always read. Sometimes he just sat and listened. Crate rested his head on Joe's boot, eyes half shut, soaking in the voices. One evening, a young man arrived with a guitar slung over his back and a nervous energy that trailed him like smoke. He said his name was Nolan. 22. Worked nights at the grocery store. Wrote songs but never sang them for anyone. Joe motioned to an open chair. Start with just one. Nolan played, voice shaking, fingers fumbling. But the words came through. About his mother's kitchen. About missing someone who never left. About being braver than you felt. The group clapped. Not polite applause, real, full-hearted clapping. Crate barked once, tail thumping against the pavement. Nolan came back the next week, and the next. People began leaving notes taped to the piano and the front door. Lyrics. Questions. Requests. Nolan turned some into full songs. He even recorded one in the bookstore during a thunderstorm, Crate's snoring audible in the background. He uploaded it online. It found listeners. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Joe didn't understand the algorithms, but he understood truth. And the kid had it. The bookstore had become a kind of refuge, not just for books and stories, but for beginnings, for second tries, for those who needed to fall apart a little before they could stand again. Joe kept writing, though less about the past now, and more about the moments right in front of him. Crate chasing a moth across the floor. A stranger leaving a single wildflower in a coffee cup by the front stoop. The sound of a torn page taped back together by steady hands. One piece he wrote in the middle of a hot Tuesday afternoon. Just 4 lines. A dog waits not for time, but for the quiet between footsteps. We rush the day, they measure it in size. He tucked it into the poetry window without signing it. The next day, someone left a note beside it. Read this out loud to my daughter. She asked if she could meet the dog who writes poems. Crate got a new nickname after that. The Poet Pup. July moved like a slow tide. Time didn't rush in the store. People stayed longer, browsed deeper, lingered with their words. Laura started keeping a guest journal by the door. Joe read it every morning like scripture. One entry. I came in to kill time. I left feeling like time noticed me. Another. If I ever disappear, I hope it's into a place like this. Joe shared them with Crate during their morning routine. Walk around the block, newspaper from the corner bin, back to the bookstore before the pavement got too hot. You're not just a dog anymore, Joe said one morning, rubbing Crate's ears. You're an ambassador of hope. Try not to let it go to your head. Crate rolled onto his back, legs twitching in mock embarrassment. Russell began organizing weekend projects, painting benches, planting flowers, organizing book drives. He called it the Crate Initiative. Said it out loud once at Story Porch, and it stuck. I figure, he said, if a dog can turn a sidewalk into a sanctuary, maybe we can too. Gary drew a logo. Laura printed flyers. A small group of volunteers grew into a modest crowd. They cleared trash from the alley, repainted the crosswalk, even started talking to the city about adding a bench near the bus stop for seniors and folks who just needed to sit. Joe didn't lead it. He just watched and smiled and wrote. The second crate of Joe's books arrived in August. Laura placed them beside the counter. This time, the cover featured Crate's silhouette against the bookstore's glowing window. Inside the back flap was a new bio. Joe doesn't believe in endings. He believes in stories that find places to grow. You'll know him by the dog at his side. The books sold slowly, just like the first ones, but each reader seemed to treat them like a conversation, not a product. One morning, a woman sat cross-legged by the poetry shelf, reading Joe's story about the diner alley for the 5th time. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy. I don't know what you did, she whispered, but thank you. Joe nodded. Crate did most of the work. She turned to the dog, who blinked once and licked her hand. The store wasn't perfect. The air conditioner broke for a week. One of the ceiling tiles caved in during a downpour. Laura threw out her back, lifting a box of old encyclopedias. But no one left. Everyone chipped in. Trish brought ice packs. Nolan wrote a goofy jingle to raise money for repairs. Miles played the piano in the afternoons to lighten the mood. And Joe wrote it all down. Not just the big moments, but the background ones too. The quiet offers of help. The way people moved a chair without being asked. The silent glances that said, "I see you. I'm glad you're here." He started collecting them in a separate notebook titled "Things That Made No Sound, But Mattered." That notebook filled fast. One morning, while taping a new poem to the window, Joe noticed a group of kids standing near the edge of the sidewalk, watching. They were pointing at Crate, then whispering, then giggling. Joe stepped outside. "Something I can help you with?" One of the boys stepped forward, holding a sketch pad. "We're making a comic book. He's the superhero." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Crate?" The kid nodded. "Yeah, his power is making people tell the truth." Joe crouched down. "That's a good power." The boy flipped open the pad. Inside were pencil drawings of Crate leaping across rooftops, listening to broken hearts, chasing away sadness with a single bark. "Mind if I keep a copy?" Joe asked. The boy grinned and tore out a page. Joe hung it by the register. Crate, the super listener. The name stuck around longer than Joe expected. By the time August faded into September, Joe had filled 3 more notebooks, received 15 letters from readers, and answered more questions about Crate than he could remember. Still, nothing changed his routine. He woke, walked, wrote, listened. And beside him, as always, Crate waited. Not for anything in particular, just to be there when someone needed a reason to stay 1 moment longer. Whatever came next, Joe didn't rush it. He knew by now. The best stories waited until you were ready to hear them. The first leaf dropped on a Tuesday morning in late September. Joe noticed it as he and Crate sat on the bench near the community garden, the one with the crooked slats and peeling green paint. It was a crisp, copper-colored thing, twirling gently through the air before landing square on Crate's nose. Crate blinked, sneezed once, and let it be. Joe chuckled and leaned back. "You've got autumn on your face, boy," he said. The season always brought a quiet with it, a turning inward. People slowed down, walked closer together, held their cups with both hands. Joe liked it. Always had. There was something honest about it. Something in the air that reminded folks to notice the world again. That day, he started a new notebook. The cover was soft blue, the paper cream-colored. He titled the first page, "The Season That Waited for Us." He didn't write anything else on it, just left it open on the counter next to Crate's water bowl, as if waiting for the right moment to begin. Laura noticed. "You haven't touched your pen all morning," she said, refilling the jar of wrapped mints by the register. Joe looked down at the blank page. "Some days the words don't need me yet." Crate let out a long sigh and flopped over on his side, his back leg twitching in a dream. October rolled in on a wind full of leaves and faraway bonfire smoke. Russell built a scarecrow out front using an old flannel shirt and half a broomstick. Gary insisted it needed a name. They settled on Lester. Crate didn't trust Lester. He gave the scarecrow wide berth and barked at it whenever the wind made it shift. "Finally found something you don't like," Joe mused. The store hosted a harvest reading. Folks brought pumpkin bread, cinnamon cider, and scarves that trailed behind them like comets. The piano was tuned for the first time in a decade. thanks to a volunteer who used to teach music in Vermont. Nolan played a song he'd written for Crate. It was slow, mostly instrumental, with a soft refrain at the end that went, "He waits where the heart finds breath," in the hush between the words. Tail curled by a sleeping step, and stillness gently stirred. Crate snored through the entire thing, and the crowd laughed like it was part of the performance. Joe didn't say much that night, just listened, sipped cider, and watched the world he'd helped build hum around him. Later, back in the storeroom, he sat on the cot and rubbed Crate's ears. "You know, I think this place could go on without me now." Crate opened one eye. "Not saying I'm going anywhere," Joe added quickly. "Just, it's good to know, you know, that if I took a long nap, someone would still refill your water." Crate blinked, stretched, and rested his chin on Joe's foot. November arrived like a hush. The energy changed again, the days shortened. People lowered their voices indoors, as if trying not to disturb the darkness too early. The window writers began meeting twice a week. Trish brought tea. Brooke handed out writing prompts printed on autumn-colored index cards. Joe started writing smaller pieces, short bursts of reflection, fragments of memory. One was about the sound of church bells on a snowy morning. Another about the way Crate cocked his head when hearing a harmonica. He pinned them by the front window. Customers began copying them into their notebooks. One woman framed one and left it on the counter with a note. "This helped me forgive someone. Thank you." Joe didn't remember which piece it was. He just nodded and thanked her. As Thanksgiving approached, Laura proposed something new. A gratitude wall. A blank canvas pinned near the back, with markers in every color. "Write one thing," she told the customers. "Just one thing you're thankful for." It filled within a week. Crate's name showed up 18 times. Joe's name 7. One square just said, "Warmth, but not just from heaters." The morning before Thanksgiving, Joe woke early. Too early. The sky outside was still dark, but something had stirred him. A sound, maybe. Or just a feeling. Crate wasn't on the cot. Not at the door either. Joe stood quickly, his back aching with the reminder of too many years, and looked around. Crate was lying by the window. Silent, eyes open, watching the sky turn slowly blue. Joe walked over, crouched beside him. "You okay?" he asked softly. Crate turned his head and licked Joe's wrist once. Joe sat down beside him and stayed there for a long time. That day, they opened the store early. Not for shopping, just for people. Carol brought muffins. Russell made eggs. Laura brewed coffee strong enough to wake the wallpaper. Joe stood by the counter, pouring hot drinks, watching laughter fill the room. Crate stayed by the heater, a little slower than usual. A little quieter. Joe noticed. He watched as Crate stood to greet a visitor, then hesitated halfway through the movement. He saw the brief flicker of discomfort, the way Crate tried to hide it. That night, Joe sat on the floor beside him. "You don't have to pretend," he whispered. "You've done enough." Crate rested his head on Joe's knee. Winter came with its usual urgency. Snow fell before December had properly introduced itself. Laura hung a string of lights in the front window. Nolan wrote a Christmas song about found family. Brooke organized a clothing drive. The shop stayed warm, busy, safe. Crate stayed close. One day, a vet came by. Not for any official reason, just a regular customer who happened to notice Crate moving a little slower. Joe let him take a look. "Nothing urgent," the man said gently. "Just age, wear and tear. Time catching up." Joe nodded. Crate slept more that week, took shorter walks, needed help getting up some mornings, but his eyes stayed bright. His tail still wagged when someone dropped a crumb. Joe wrote shorter stories now. Barely a page. Some just a paragraph. He titled one, "Thank You for Staying." Crate's blue sweater had started to fray. A volunteer knitted a new one, deep red with a gold trim. Joe slipped it on carefully. Crate gave a single sneeze in protest, then settled into it like a king into royal robes. Christmas came. The shop closed early. Everyone stayed late. They sang songs, exchanged handwritten cards, and read stories out loud. Someone brought mistletoe. It hung above Crate's bed for no reason other than joy. Joe sat by the window. Crate curled at his feet. "This feels like everything," Joe said. Laura nodded. "That's because it is." That night, for the first time in a long time, Joe slept without interruption. The next morning was quiet. No snow, just frost on the windows. Joe woke slowly, reached for his slippers, then turned toward the cot where Crate usually slept. Empty. He stood fast, heart thudding harder than it had in years. But then he saw it. Crate at the window, sitting upright, tail thumping. Joe smiled, exhaled. They walked, slow and steady, to the bench by the community garden. Sat in silence, watched the sun rise together. Joe didn't say much. Didn't need to. Crate leaned into his side. When they returned to the bookstore, Joe opened his notebook, the blue one, the one still mostly blank. He turned to the first page, beneath the title, and wrote, "He found me when I had nothing left to offer, and still waited beside me like I was worth every second. He never asked for more than company, and yet gave more than I knew I could receive. This was not just a dog. He was the place I came home to." Joe didn't write anything else that day. He placed the notebook on the shelf behind the register, beside the first one, the one about the diner alley and the crate and the sandwich that started it all. People came and went. Seasons changed. The world moved forward. But in the heart of the small bookstore, beneath the humming light, a man and his dog had left something behind that didn't need fanfare or explanation. Just the quiet echo of a story told right, and the soft sigh of a friend who stayed long enough to finish it.